All right, so how can we learn about this if we're not going to go delving deep into differential equations? Well, let's look at what we can learn from looking at real-world flyers. And specifically, I want to look at insects because there are some important misconceptions and limitations to physics. First of all, probably most of you have heard the story about like how science can't explain how the bumblebee can fly, or according to physics, bees shouldn't be able to fly, but the bee doesn't know any better, so it flies stubbornly anyways. Yada yada. I get this email at least once every other year from some well-intentioned relative or friend. This is a load of horsepucky. Yes, the story originates because years ago, like well over a century ago, someone was trying to apply a concept called the Reynolds number, which has to do with how in fixed-wing aircraft you get a certain amount of, let's just say that things like lift and drag are kind of like put together relative to size, without going into any math right now, and you get a number that like gives you some clues as to how the animal will perform. Well, they decided for fun to try to apply this to the really little wings of the bumblebee, and they got a Reynolds number that was unworkable, and they're like, well, obviously it must fly some other way than like the ways we think of Reynolds numbers going. Well, that spawned this whole sort of inspirational message of, see, don't let other people limit you, and that's fine, except that this is physics, and physics does limit what you can do in the real world. And we actually have a really good understanding of exactly how things like bees can fly. And this is sort of the answer. Things like bees and small insects, when they fly, are small enough that the air does not act in the same way the air does for us. That is, they're small enough that the little currents and eddies coming off of the air actually generates it acts more like water is the best analogy I can make to you. If you've ever put on, say, flippers in the water, you'll notice that, with long, smooth moments, your flippers can keep you in place in the water, and that's because the liquid swirls coming off of there have other effects on you. It's not just the initial kick, but the viscosity of the liquid has an impact on where you stay. And insects are small enough that the viscosity of air influences the aerodynamics of how they fly. So right, like when an insect wing flaps, it actually is creating whirls. And indeed, when a bird or a big thing flaps, they do too. But the insect is small enough that the viscosity of the air helps actually pull them in the direction it's going. Whereas if I flap my arms, there are indeed incredibly small whirls, but the viscosity powers are so weak it doesn't do a darn thing for me. And actually, in the water, you have this problem too. It's just hard to do. If you have something moving incredibly fast through water, it actually alters the physics, the hydrodynamics of water too. But because water is very, very viscous, things our size have a pretty hard time moving with that sort of speed through water. So yes, yeah, and you'll definitely need a more viscous air then. Yeah, the issue with cornstarch and things that move get thicker the faster you move are not a bad analogy, actually, if you're trying to apply it to big things. And yeah, belly flops are another good example of the importance of that's actually surface tension as well as viscosity teaming up to really get you when you belly flop. They team you something nasty too if you belly flop from any height. So we're not going to go too deeply into insect design because I suspect that most of you, we're dealing mostly with vertebrates right now, most of you are developing larger creatures. But I will say that there are some bigger insects, moths and butterflies do this, and they take much smaller advantage of that. So if you are trying to design bigger animals that are sort of insectoid or use insectoid-like wings, you're going to want to look at some of those really big flyers as the best bet. Although even these guys have issues with the strength of materials in their wings once you get to a certain size. But you could maybe fix that by being clever about how you, like designing a composite material wing where like you had like a visible outside and some struts with more of this sort of material that you see in butterflies in between or something, or some other solution. But that would be your best bet to make a large insectoid flyer. What you can't do is what we saw in, well, the most recent X-Men movie, Was that the most recent one? I may have lost track. Well, the X-Men First Class, where they had a creature who I think went by the nickname of Angel, and she had oversized dragon wings that buzzed so fast that you couldn't see them moving. And let's just say that that would not work at all. So, and, you know, it's a movie. It looked cool. One thing they did pretty well in that, I thought, was there was kind of a fight sequence at the end where she was flying around. And they did make her move relatively slowly. She seemed to, in the air-to-air combat, more surprise people, come up over a ship's bow or something. And she seemed to move with, like, when she would turn, there'd be quite a bit of momentum to her turn. And I will say that for an absolutely impossible form of flight, those were pretty good cheats to suggest that, like, it wasn't working really well. Or as well as, like, perhaps really giant flappy vertebrate wings would have. So in terms of like a good cheat, they did at least attempt to make it look more plausible in motion, and it sort of helped, I think, probably save it so there weren't as many laughs by audiences at this one, although I didn't see it in theaters, so I don't honestly know. Okay. So just to sum that up real fast before we go on to like more relevant flyers. So first of all, we know how bumblebees fly. So as all of the excellent students that you are, please never, ever say this again. Ever. Not that it irritates me or anything. And the reason we know how they fly, because we can study them now in like super slow motion and in like little smoke-based wind tunnels and stuff like that, is that insects fly through the air using forms of lift that are not available to things that aren't incredibly small. And because of that, they really don't work too well for flying people or flying dragons or flying anything else. So by the way, there's a hypothesis, which may not actually be true, but one of the hypotheses about why there were bigger dragonflies in the deep past, even before most of the age of dinosaurs, and there aren't any around today, was that the air may have been slightly thicker with elevated oxygen levels back then, and also that, well, it also has to do with their breathing. With elevated oxygen levels, they'd be able to more easily breathe, because insects do not generally breathe in through lungs, through mouths the way we do. They actually have a series of tubes that connect directly to the surface of their skin, and the air just sort of passes in and out through there, hopefully at a high enough rate to let them, like, ventilate, yeah, through its spiracles. And if you had higher oxygen, of course, the oxygen would be more likely to cross into the tube system and get to their lungs. So it would allow more activity at larger sizes. This, by the way, is one of the biggest problems. Everyone wonders whether exoskeletons could get big, and we'll talk about this next week. They could. The biggest problem for insects is breathing at large sizes. And if that could be solved, and there are ways you could come up with to solve it, you would not have nearly as many constraints on insect size as you do on our planet.